Elliot Harper had always been different from the other residents of Willowbrook Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood tucked away at the edge of town. While most people spent their weekends trimming hedges or painting fences to keep up appearances, Elliot could often be found wading through the shallow waters of the creek that ran along the back of their property. To Elliot, this little stretch of water wasn't just a natural feature, it was a sanctuary, a living piece of history that carried stories older than anyone in the neighborhood. The creek had flowed there long before houses were built. Long before streets were paved, and certainly long before the Homeowners Association, HOA, decided what was safe or unsafe. It was a ribbon of life weaving its way through the land, home to frogs, minnows, dragonflies, and even an occasional heron stopping by for a visit. For Elliot, it was more than just nature, it was family. Their grandmother, who had passed away 3 years ago, used to sit on the porch overlooking the creek, telling tales about how she'd watched deer drink from its banks when she was young. After inheriting the house, Elliot vowed to protect it, not just as a tribute to their grandmother, but also because they believed some things shouldn't belong to anyone. The creek was one of those things, but not everyone saw it that way. Willowbrook Heights prided itself on orderliness. Every lawn was manicured, every driveway spotless, and every rule enforced by the HOA with military precision. At the helm of this operation was Margaret Lyle, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose clipboard seemed permanently attached to her hand. Margaret ran the HOA meetings like a courtroom drama, doling out fines for everything from mismatched curtains to overgrown shrubs. She viewed herself as the guardian of the community's standards, and anything outside her definition of perfection was deemed a threat. When rumors began circulating about complaints regarding the creek, Elliot wasn't surprised. Someone had reported seeing kids playing near the water during summer afternoons. Another neighbor claimed they'd spotted algae floating downstream. And then came the big accusation. The creek posed a danger to children. Margaret seized on this idea like a lawyer building a case. "It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt," she declared at the next HOA meeting. "We need to take action." Most residents nodded along without much thought. After all, they didn't use the creek themselves. They barely noticed it existed unless it flooded slightly during heavy rains. Why fight over something so insignificant? But Elliot sat silently in the corner of the room, fists clenched under the table. They knew better than anyone that the creek wasn't dangerous if treated with respect. Accidents happened everywhere, on roads and pools, even inside homes. But no one suggested paving over driveways or filling in swimming pools. Why target the creek? Margaret's campaign gained momentum quickly. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, warning of potential hazards. Petitions circulated calling for immediate intervention. Before Elliot could rally support among the handful of neighbors who appreciated the creek, the HOA held a vote, and predictably, the majority sided with Margaret. The decision was made. The creek would be drained. Elliot left the meeting feeling defeated but determined. As they walked home, the sound of running water greeted them like an old friend. Standing on the bank, they dipped their fingers into the cool stream, letting the current swirl around their hand. A memory surfaced, Grandma sitting nearby, humming softly while knitting scarves. "This place matters," Grandma had said once. "Don't let anyone take it away from you." For now, the creek still flowed, but Elliot knew time was running out. If the HOA got their way, this peaceful corner of the world would vanish forever, and deep down, a spark of defiance ignited. Maybe they couldn't stop the bulldozers alone, but maybe, just maybe, there was another way to make the HOA understand exactly what they were destroying. It started with a letter slipped under Elliot's front door early one morning. Printed neatly across the page was the official notice. Drainage work on the creek would begin within 2 weeks. No further discussion, no appeals process, just a cold statement of intent wrapped in bureaucratic language. Elliot stared at the paper, heart pounding. This wasn't just about losing a patch of land anymore. It felt personal, like someone had slapped them across the face. Over the next few days, Elliot tried everything they could think of to delay or reverse the decision. They visited sympathetic neighbors, hoping to gather signatures for a counter-petition. They emailed environmental groups, asking for advice or support. They even called local reporters, hoping to shine a light on the issue. But none of it worked. Neighbors shrugged apologetically, saying they didn't want trouble. Environmental organizations expressed sympathy but explained they couldn't intervene without proof of ecological harm. Reporters promised to look into it but never followed up. Meanwhile, the HOA wasted no time. Within a week, orange cones appeared along the creek's edge, marking where excavation would begin. Construction crews arrived soon after, armed with bulldozers and sledgehammers. On the first day of work, Elliot stood at the fence watching helplessly as machines tore into the earth. The sound of crunching rocks and splintering branches echoed through the air, drowning out the usual chirping of birds. By lunchtime, the once clear water had turned murky brown, choked with sediment stirred up by the chaos. That evening, Elliot wandered down to the ravaged site. Where vibrant green reeds used to sway gently in the breeze, there was now a barren trench littered with debris. The frogs were gone. So were the dragonflies. Even the heron that occasionally graced the area hadn't returned since the commotion began. It was as though the soul of the place had been ripped out overnight. As Elliot knelt by the muddy remains, tears welled up in their eyes, not just for the loss of the creek, but for the sheer arrogance of it all. How could anyone look at such destruction and call it progress? Who gave these people the right to decide what mattered and what didn't? Sleep eluded Elliot that night. Images of bulldozers grinding through dirt haunted their dreams. When dawn broke, they rose with a strange clarity. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, fine. Elliot would show them dirty, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. Because sometimes drastic measures were the only way to wake people up. The idea came to them suddenly, fully formed. Years ago, Elliot had studied hydrology in college, fascinated by how water shaped landscapes. They remembered learning about underground springs feeding into creeks like theirs, hidden pathways invisible to the naked eye. What if they could tap into those sources, redirect them somewhere else? Somewhere problematic? At first, the plan seemed impossible. Rerouting water required tools, knowledge, and stealth, all things difficult to manage alone. But as Elliot mulled it over, excitement replaced doubt. They weren't just fighting for revenge. They were fighting for justice. Justice for the creek. Justice for their grandmother. Justice for every living thing that had called this place home. By midweek, Elliot had sketched out a rough blueprint. Using supplies from the shed and scraps scavenged from abandoned construction sites, they pieced together a makeshift system of pipes and trenches. Working late into the night, they dug carefully beneath the surface, ensuring their efforts stayed hidden from prying eyes. Sweat dripped down their face as they labored, hands blistered and raw. But every ache reminded them why they were doing this. Every shovel full of dirt brought them closer to reclaiming what was stolen. And then, one fateful night, it happened. With trembling hands, Elliot opened the valve connecting the underground spring to their network of pipes. A faint gurgling sound filled the air as water surged forward, following its new path. At first, nothing seemed different. But as hours passed, subtle signs emerged. Puddles formed in low-lying areas. Soil softened. Lawns grew damp. The HOA's pristine kingdom was about to get a rude awakening, and Elliot couldn't wait to see their reaction. Little did they know this was only the beginning. Elliot watched with quiet satisfaction as their plan began to take shape. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. Small puddles forming in low-lying areas, patches of grass turning greener than usual, and a faint dampness lingering in the air after sunset. But soon the effects became harder to ignore. Neighbors started noticing soggy lawns that refused to dry out, no matter how much they raked or aerated. One man complained about water pooling near his driveway, making it impossible to back his car out without splashing mud everywhere. Margaret Lyle, ever vigilant, was quick to dismiss these issues as weather-related quirks. "It's just been unusually rainy this season," she announced at the next HOA meeting, her tone dismissive. "Nothing to worry about." Most residents nodded along, eager to believe her explanation. After all, who wanted to think there might be something more sinister happening beneath their feet? But Elliot knew better. Every morning they walked through the neighborhood under the guise of an innocent stroll, secretly surveying the damage. What started as harmless puddles had grown into persistent wet spots, spreading slowly but steadily toward the heart of Willowbrook Heights. Some yards now looked like marshlands, with muddy patches sprouting weeds instead of manicured grass. A few homeowners reported strange smells wafting from their basements, a musty odor that hinted at moisture seeping into places it shouldn't. Still, nobody suspected Elliot. Why would they? Everyone saw them as the eccentric loner who spent too much time by the drained creek, muttering to themselves about nature's rights. No one imagined they could orchestrate such a subtle yet effective act of defiance. Even when Margaret glared accusingly during meetings, Elliot maintained a poker face, shrugging off her accusations with practiced nonchalance. The tension between Elliot and the HOA simmered below the surface, growing stronger with each passing day. Margaret seemed particularly frustrated, pacing back and forth during meetings while clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "We can't let this continue," she snapped one evening, pointing at photos of flooded driveways and waterlogged flower beds. "Something is causing this, and we need answers." Her frustration only fueled Elliot's resolve. Late at night, they tinkered with their makeshift system of pipes and trenches, fine-tuning the flow of water to ensure maximum impact without raising suspicion. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally. Guilt gnawed at the edges of their conscience. What if someone got hurt? What if an elderly neighbor slipped on a slick patch of ground? Yet every time doubt crept in, Elliot reminded themselves of the bigger picture. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about teaching the HOA a lesson they wouldn't forget. As weeks turned into months, the situation escalated. Basements began flooding, forcing some families to call plumbers and contractors to assess the damage. One homeowner, Mr. Henderson, found himself ankle-deep in water when he went downstairs to retrieve a toolbox. His wife blamed a burst pipe, but the plumber couldn't find any leaks. Instead, he pointed to rising groundwater levels as the likely culprit. "It's like the whole area is sinking into a swamp," he muttered, shaking his head. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Panic set in as more people discovered similar problems in their homes. Margaret called yet another emergency meeting, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "This isn't normal rainwater," she insisted, slamming her fist on the table for emphasis. "Someone is doing this on purpose, and I have my suspicions." All eyes turned to Elliot, who sat calmly in the corner, arms crossed. They met Margaret's glare with a steady gaze, refusing to flinch. "If you're so sure it's sabotage," they said coolly, "then prove it. Until then, maybe you should focus less on blaming people and more on fixing the real problem." The room erupted into murmurs, some siding with Margaret, others whispering doubts about her accusations. For Elliot, it was a small victory. Not exoneration, but enough to buy time to execute the next phase of their plan. As they left the meeting, they allowed themselves a brief smile. The HOA was finally starting to feel the weight of their actions, and this was only the beginning. The breaking point came on a stormy Tuesday evening, when dark clouds rolled over Willowbrook Heights and unleashed a torrential downpour. Rain pounded against rooftops and flooded streets, overwhelming the already saturated ground. Thanks to Elliot's rerouted water system, the deluge transformed into a full-blown crisis. Creeks of runoff surged across lawns, spilling into garages and basements. Cars parked in driveways floated like boats in shallow ponds. Gardens, once meticulously tended, were reduced to muddy swamps. By morning, the neighborhood resembled a disaster zone. Margaret Lyle stood in the middle of her flooded backyard, staring in disbelief at the chaos around her. Her prized rose bushes were submerged, their delicate petals torn apart by the rushing water. Across the street, Mrs. Thompson sobbed as she surveyed her ruined vegetable garden, where rows of tomatoes and cucumbers now lay buried under inches of silt. Children waded through knee-deep puddles, laughing despite the destruction. while their parents exchanged frantic phone calls with insurance agents and contractors. For Elliot, watching the scene unfold felt surreal. Part of them reveled in the irony. The same people who had dismissed the creek as expendable were now drowning in its remnants. But another part wrestled with guilt. Was this really what they'd wanted? To punish innocent families caught in the crossfire? The line between justice and vengeance had blurred, leaving Elliot uneasy. Margaret wasted no time pointing fingers. That afternoon she marched straight to Elliot's front door, her face red with fury. "You did this," she accused, jabbing a finger in their direction. "Admit it, you've been sabotaging us since the beginning." Elliot leaned casually against the doorframe, arms folded. "Prove it," they replied, echoing their earlier challenge. "You're quick to accuse, Margaret, but slow to admit your own mistakes. Maybe if you hadn't destroyed the creek, none of this would have happened." "You're insane," Margaret spat, throwing up her hands. "Do you realize how much damage you've caused? People are losing thousands of dollars because of your little stunt." Elliot's jaw tightened, but they held their ground. "And how much do you think the creek was worth? Did you even stop to consider that before you drained it? Nature doesn't belong to you or me. It belongs to everyone, including the frogs, the fish, and yes, even the kids you claim to care about." Margaret opened her mouth to retort, but before she could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel drew their attention. A local news van pulled up to the curb, followed by a reporter holding a microphone and camera crew lugging heavy equipment. Word of the flooding had reached the media, and they were here to investigate. Elliot's stomach churned. This was uncharted territory. While they had hoped to expose the HOA's hypocrisy, they hadn't anticipated becoming the center of public scrutiny. As the reporter approached, Margaret seized the opportunity to shift blame. "This is the person responsible," she declared, gesturing dramatically at Elliot. "They've been tampering with our water systems for months." The reporter turned to Elliot, microphone extended. "Is that true? Are you behind the flooding?" Elliot hesitated, weighing their options. Denying everything might protect them legally, but it wouldn't address the larger issue. Taking a deep breath, they stepped forward. "I didn't start this," they said firmly. "The HOA did when they decided to destroy the creek. All I've done is show them the consequences of their actions. Ask yourself, why does a community need rules if those rules ignore basic respect for the environment?" The interview aired that night, sparking heated debates online and offline. Some viewers praised Elliot as a hero standing up to corporate greed, while others condemned their methods as reckless and dangerous. Meanwhile, Margaret scrambled to contain the fallout, calling emergency meetings and issuing press releases to distance the HOA from responsibility. But the damage was done. The floodwaters may have receded, but trust within the community had eroded completely. Neighbors eyed each other warily, unsure whom to believe. And Elliot, standing alone amidst the wreckage, realized they had achieved their goal, but at a cost far greater than they'd anticipated. The storm that hit Willowbrook Heights was unlike anything the neighborhood had seen in decades. Heavy rain pounded the ground for hours, relentless and unforgiving. The already saturated soil couldn't absorb another drop, and Elliot's rerouted water system turned into a force of nature. Underground springs surged with renewed energy, feeding directly into the HOA-controlled properties. What began as puddles quickly escalated into full-blown floods. Basements filled with water so rapidly that some families barely had time to grab essentials before evacuating. Cars floated in driveways like abandoned boats, their interiors ruined by muddy floodwaters. Power lines sagged dangerously close to the rising tide, forcing utility crews to shut off electricity to half the neighborhood. Children played in the chaos, splashing through knee-deep water, while their parents frantically called insurance companies and debated whether they'd ever recover financially. Margaret Lyle stood on her porch, umbrella clutched tightly in one hand, staring at the devastation around her. Her meticulously maintained garden was now a swamp, her prized azaleas uprooted and floating aimlessly. She looked less like the authoritative figurehead of the HOA and more like someone who had just lost control of everything she held dear. Elliot watched the scene unfold from their living room window, heart racing. This wasn't part of the plan. Or at least, not entirely. They had intended to make the HOA uncomfortable, to force them to confront the consequences of their actions. But this level of destruction, it felt overwhelming, even to Elliot. Guilt gnawed at them as they saw neighbors struggling to salvage what little remained of their homes. Was this justice or vengeance gone too far? Then came the knock at the door. Margaret stormed inside without waiting for an invitation, her face red with fury. "You did this," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Elliot. "Look at what you've done. People are losing everything because of your selfishness." Elliot met her glare head-on, refusing to back down. "Selfish?" they shot back. "You destroyed an entire ecosystem because it was inconvenient for you. You didn't think twice about ruining something irreplaceable, and now you're blaming me for showing you the cost of your choices." "This isn't about teaching lessons," Margaret snapped, pacing the room. "This is about real people, suffering because of your games." Before Elliot could respond, there was another knock, this time louder, more insistent. Outside stood a local news crew, cameras rolling. A reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. "We understand there's been significant flooding here in Willowbrook Heights. Can either of you comment on what's happening?" Margaret immediately seized the moment, stepping onto the porch and positioning herself front and center. "This disaster is no accident," she declared, gesturing wildly toward Elliot. "One individual has deliberately tampered with our water systems, causing catastrophic damage to innocent homeowners." All eyes turned to Elliot, who froze for a split second before composing themselves. Stepping outside, they faced the camera calmly. "If anyone's responsible for this mess, it's the HOA," they said firmly. "They drained a vital natural resource without considering the consequences. All I've done is expose the truth, that when you disrupt nature, it fights back." The interview went viral almost instantly. Clips of the confrontation dominated social media feeds, sparking heated debates across the country. Some viewers hailed Elliot as a modern-day Robin Hood, standing up to corporate greed and environmental neglect. Others branded them reckless and dangerous, accusing them of endangering lives for personal vendettas. Meanwhile, Margaret worked tirelessly to spin the narrative in the HOA's favor, issuing statements and holding press conferences to distance herself from blame. But the cracks in the community were undeniable. Neighbors who once trusted each other now eyed one another suspiciously. Those sympathetic to Elliot whispered behind closed doors, while others openly condemned their actions. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. For Elliot, the attention was both exhilarating and exhausting. They had succeeded in making the HOA pay for their arrogance, but at what cost? As they walked along the edge of the flooded creek bed later that night, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line. Revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it left scars that took years to heal. In the weeks following the flood, Willowbrook Heights resembled a ghost town. Contractors roamed the streets, hauling away soggy furniture and replacing warped floorboards. Insurance adjusters conducted endless inspections, scribbling notes on clipboards as frustrated homeowners vented their anger. The air smelled of damp, wood and mildew, a constant reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. Legally, things weren't looking good for Elliot. The HOA filed formal complaints against them, accusing them of property damage and negligence. Fines piled up, threatening to bankrupt them. Lawyers advised settling out of court, but Elliot refused to admit wrongdoing. To do so would mean conceding defeat, not just to the HOA, but to the idea that progress always came at the expense of nature. Meanwhile, public opinion remained divided. Supporters sent messages of encouragement, praising Elliot's bravery, and calling for greater environmental accountability. Critics bombarded them with hate mail, labeling them a menace to society. Even within the neighborhood, tensions ran high. Some neighbors thanked Elliot privately, admitting they agreed with their stance but feared retaliation from the HOA. Others avoided them altogether, treating them like a pariah. Amidst the turmoil, Margaret Lyle found herself under fire as well. Homeowners demanded answers, questioning why she hadn't anticipated the risks of draining the creek. Her once unshakable authority crumbled as residents grew increasingly vocal about their dissatisfaction. At one particularly heated meeting, A group of angry homeowners confronted her, demanding transparency and accountability. Faced with mounting pressure, the HOA finally relented. In a dramatic reversal, they announced plans to restore the creek, not just as a gesture of goodwill, but as a necessity to prevent future flooding. Environmental experts were brought in to oversee the project, ensuring the ecosystem would be rebuilt responsibly. Funding came partly from the HOA's budget and partly from grants secured thanks to the newfound attention on Willowbrook Heights. Elliot attended the groundbreaking ceremony reluctantly, unsure how they fit into this new chapter. As bulldozers gave way to conservationists planting native vegetation, they felt a mix of pride and regret. Pride, because their actions had forced the HOA to take responsibility. Regret, because the road to restoration had been paved with unnecessary pain and division. Over time, the neighborhood began to heal. Families returned to their repaired homes, cautiously optimistic about the future. Kids played near the newly restored creek, supervised by parents who now understood its value. Slowly, trust started to rebuild, not just between neighbors but between humans and the land they shared. For Elliot, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Legal battles dragged on, but they focused their energy on advocacy work, speaking at local schools and community events about the importance of preserving natural resources. Though scars remained, they learned to channel their passion constructively, becoming a voice for change rather than conflict. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the rippling water, Elliot sat on the bank of the creek. Frogs croaked in the distance and dragonflies darted gracefully above the surface. For the first time in months, they felt at peace. Nature had forgiven them. Now it was up to the people to do the same. Months passed, and Willowbrook Heights began to transform in ways no one could have predicted. The restored creek flowed steadily once again, its banks lined with wildflowers and tall grasses that danced gently in the breeze. Birds returned, filling the air with songs that hadn't been heard in years. Fish darted through the clear water, their silvery scales catching the sunlight. It was as if nature itself had forgiven the neighborhood for its mistakes. And maybe it had. Elliot stood by the creek often, watching children play under the watchful eyes of their parents. They marveled at how quickly attitudes had shifted. What was once seen as a hazard was now cherished as a gift. Parents taught their kids about the importance of respecting the environment, using the creek as a living classroom. Even Margaret, Lyle, softened her stance, occasionally joining cleanup efforts or attending community meetings where environmental initiatives were discussed. Though she still avoided direct eye contact with Elliot, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement that both sides had learned painful lessons. The HOA, too, underwent significant changes. No longer obsessed with enforcing trivial rules, they focused on fostering harmony within the community. Committees were formed to address sustainability projects, from installing rain barrels to planting native trees. Neighbors who had once argued over fence heights now collaborated on shared gardens. Slowly but surely, Willowbrook Heights became less about perfection and more about connection, not just among people but also with the land they called home. For Elliot, this marked a turning point. The legal battles eventually settled out of the court, with the HOA agreeing to drop charges in exchange for Elliot's promise to cease any further environmental interventions. While some might have considered this a loss, Elliot saw it differently. Winning wasn't about proving a point. It was about sparking change, and they had done exactly that. With newfound purpose, Elliot channeled their energy into activism beyond Willowbrook Heights. They partnered with local organizations to advocate for wetland preservation, speaking passionately at town halls and schools about the delicate balance between development and conservation. Their story became a cautionary tale turned inspiration, reminding others that progress didn't have to come at the cost of destruction. But perhaps the most profound change happened within Elliot themselves. Once consumed by anger and defiance, they now approached challenges with patience and empathy. They realized that fighting for something you love doesn't always mean tearing down those who oppose you. It can also mean building bridges. Through conversations with neighbors, they discovered common ground. Everyone wanted safety, beauty, and a sense of belonging. By focusing on these shared values, they found allies instead of enemies. One crisp autumn afternoon, Elliot decided to host a small gathering by the creek. They invited neighbors, including Margaret, though they doubted she'd show up. To their surprise, nearly everyone attended. Laughter echoed along the water's edge as families shared picnic blankets and stories. Someone brought a guitar, strumming gentle chords while others sang along. For the first time in years, the community felt whole. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Elliot addressed the group. "I know we've been through a lot," they began, their voice steady yet warm. "And I know I haven't always made things easy. But I hope we can agree on one thing. This place is special, not because of our houses or our lawns, but because of what flows through it. This creek, this life. Let's protect it together." The crowd erupted into applause, even Margaret offering a reluctant nod. As the evening drew to a close, Elliot lingered by the water, gazing at the reflections shimmering on its surface. Memories of their grandmother came flooding back, the sound of her laughter, the wisdom in her words. She had always believed in the power of nature to heal wounds, both visible and invisible. Now standing here surrounded by renewed hope and unity, Elliot finally understood what she meant. Life would never be perfect. Not in Willowbrook Heights, not anywhere. Mistakes would still be made, disagreements would arise, and tensions would flare. But as long as the creek flowed, carrying with it the promise of renewal, there was hope. Hope that people could learn from their past, grow stronger together, and find beauty in the imperfect world around them. Elliot smiled softly, feeling the cool breeze brush against their face. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they allowed themselves a moment of peace. After all, sometimes the greatest victories aren't won through conflict. They're built through understanding, forgiveness, and a willingness to start anew. And in that moment, Elliot knew they had truly come home.